FBI Agent Elara froze, her face pale with shock, as her K-9 pulled her into the dawn meadow. A filthy man lay motionless in the dry grass, surrounded by 3 lions. One lion bared its teeth, eyes burning, its low growl cutting through the silence. Elara reached for her radio, but her dog refused to bark. Then the man's fingers moved. If you believe God sends help through the most unlikely creatures, leave Amen. Loonhaven, Minnesota, looked like the kind of town where trouble would feel embarrassed to show its face. It sat north and bright near Lake Superior, wrapped in pine forests, clear water, golden late spring grass, and narrow roads that seemed to lead not to destinations, but to old memories. The air smelled of wet cedar, warm soil, and lake wind. For most people, it would have felt peaceful. For FBI Agent Elara Vance, peace felt like a room where someone had hidden the truth under the floorboards. Elara was 30 years old, tall and athletic, with chestnut brown hair tied low at the back of her neck, and calm gray-blue eyes that often noticed what others stepped around. She wore a dark field jacket over a pale shirt, black tactical pants, and the tired expression of someone who had been told to rest when her heart still wanted to work. Her superiors had called this trip mandatory recovery leave. Elara called it being quietly pushed aside. After a recent case involving cold storage rooms and illegally transported animals, her K-9 partner had begun waking at night, ears raised, body tense, as if some invisible door had just slammed shut inside his memory. Beside her in the passenger seat sat Alder, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat, dark along the back and shoulders, amber brown eyes, tall, alert ears, and a noble face that could look both ancient and childlike in the same breath. Alder was still brave, still obedient, still brilliant at his work. But lately the sound of metal rolling doors, veterinary antiseptic, or refrigeration units made his body grow still in a way Elara did not like. She had brought him to Bright Antler Wildlife Sanctuary because a federal K-9 behavior specialist said rescued animals, open fields, and slow routines might help him remember that not every cold room held sorrow. They stayed at the Willow Cup Inn, a small lakeside guest house painted cream and blue with flower boxes under the windows and the smell of apple pastry drifting from the kitchen. Its owner, Nora Bell, was 67, round-cheeked and silver-haired, with soft brown skin weathered by years of lake wind and a cheerful voice that made every sentence feel like an invitation to sit down. She wore knitted cardigans even in warm weather and immediately called Alder Mr. Detective Ears, which made Elara smile for the first time in 3 days. Nora had the gentle habit of speaking to dogs as if they understood bills, weather, and the disappointing behavior of grown men. Bright Antler Wildlife Sanctuary was hosting Northern Kindness Day when Elara arrived the next morning. Elderly visitors moved slowly along gravel paths. Veterans in ball caps drank coffee near a booth selling jam. Children pointed at painted signs of bears, wolves, and lynx. The place looked harmless in the bright sun, almost holy in the way only a sanctuary can seem holy. All fences, second chances, and creatures learning that hands could bring food instead of fear. Elara told herself she was only here for Alder. No badge work, no chasing shadows, just a woman and her dog trying to sleep again. Maggie Bell, the sanctuary manager, met them near the visitor barn. Maggie was in her mid-50s, lean and sun-browned, with short gray hair tucked beneath a green cap and the quick, practical walk of someone who had cleaned more cages than she had attended meetings. Her laugh came easily, but her eyes were sharp. She explained that Bright Antler cared for rescued animals that could never return to the wild, aging big cats, injured birds, shy foxes, and one Canada lynx still under medical observation. Alder walked politely beside Elara, but his nose never stopped working. Then, halfway through the behind-the-scenes path, Alder froze. A low metallic hum rolled from somewhere beyond the barns, so faint most people would have mistaken it for wind against a loose pipe. Alder's ears snapped forward, and for one strange second the bright sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Before Elara could speak, Alder pulled toward a dry meadow behind a secondary fence. Elara followed, one hand lowering toward her radio. Then she saw him. A man lay in the tall yellow grass as if he had fallen asleep in the middle of an ordinary picnic. His faded flannel shirt was dusty, his jeans were streaked with mud, and one arm covered his eyes. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and unshaven, with dark hair ruffled by the grass. Around him rested 3 enormous lions. One lay near his boots, one near his shoulder, and the largest, an older lioness with a pale gold face, watched the fence with the solemn patience of a queen who had seen too many foolish humans. Elara stopped at once. She did not shout. She did not rush. She held position, kept Alder close, and spoke into the radio with a controlled voice. "This is Agent Vance near the East Meadow. I have an adult male inside the lion enclosure. I need staff assistance now." Maggie came running, took one look, and burst into laughter. Elara stared at her. "That is not usually the response I get to a man surrounded by lions." "Oh, honey," Maggie said, wiping her eyes. "That is Caleb. If you wake him too suddenly, Juniper gets offended. She takes nap etiquette very seriously." The man lowered his arm and opened one eye. He blinked at Elara, then at Alder, then raised 2 fingers in a lazy greeting. "Morning." Caleb Rourke was 36, with a hard, angular face softened only by tired hazel eyes and a short, dark beard that looked more practical than stylish. His body carried quiet strength, not the showy kind, but the kind built by discipline, bad weather, and years of doing difficult things without complaint. Maggie explained that Caleb was the primary caretaker for Solace, Mercy, and Juniper, 3 rescued lionesses who had lived too long in poor conditions before coming to Bright Antler. They were not tame. They were not pets. They trusted routines, familiar scents, full bellies, slow movements, and Caleb. Solace, the oldest, struggled at night when metal doors rattled. Caleb had begun sitting outside with her months ago, reading in a low voice until she rested. Eventually, he started sleeping in the meadow after feeding and health checks, always under camera watch, with staff nearby and strict rules in place. It sounded strange, but it was not careless. It was care, practiced one patient night at a time. Alder did not growl at Caleb. Instead, the German shepherd sat down and studied him with a solemn stillness that made Elara uneasy. It was the look Alder gave old witnesses, frightened children, and rooms where secrets had weight. Caleb looked back at the dog, and something passed between them that Elara could not name. Recognition, perhaps, not friendship. Not yet. More like 2 tired sentries meeting at the edge of the same storm. Later, as the tour moved behind the veterinary building, Alder pulled again. This time he led Elara toward a locked storage area behind a row of stacked feed bags. A white shipping label clung to a cold storage crate. Frozen aquatic research samples. Alder sniffed the corner, then stepped back, ears high, body rigid. Elara caught the scent, too, faint but wrong. Dry ice, machine oil, veterinary chemicals, and something organic beneath it all. Before she could ask Maggie about it, a shadow moved in the next enclosure. A Canada lynx stood on a flat stone, silver-gray fur shining in the afternoon light, green-gold eyes fixed on Alder. Maggie introduced her as Aria, a female lynx in temporary medical recovery. Aria was lean, elegant, and wary, with tufted ears and a thin, pale mark behind one ear. Not dramatic, not large, just enough to suggest someone had once taken something from her without permission. Alder did not approach. He simply lay down several yards away. After a long moment, Aria did not retreat. That night at the Willow Cup Inn, Nora brought tea to Elara's small table and placed a printed receipt beside the cup. Her smile had lost its morning brightness. She explained that the Save the Arctic Mothers Fund had withdrawn money from her account several times, though she had only agreed to donate once. Elara meant to reassure her gently, to tell her to call the bank. But then she saw the name at the bottom of the receipt, Northern Renewal Trust. Elara set the receipt beside the photo she had taken of the cold storage label at Bright Antler. Alder rose from the rug, sniffed the paper, and gave the same sharp, silent reaction he had given outside the veterinary building. Not fear. Warning. Elara looked toward the dark window. Beyond the lake road, beyond the pines, Bright Antler sat under the moon like a place built for mercy. But somewhere inside it, something cold was humming. Alder stood at the window, staring toward the sanctuary, his ears lifted, while far away a low refrigeration sound drifted through the night like a warning no human was meant to hear. By morning, Elara Vance had learned that a quiet town could hide numbers more troubling than screams. She sat at the small oak table in the Willow Cup Inn's breakfast room while Nora Bell poured coffee with hands that trembled just enough to make the spoon tap the saucer. Outside, Lake Superior shone under a pale silver sky, and the pines along the road moved gently in the wind. Everything looked peaceful. That was what bothered Elara most. Peace, she had learned, was sometimes the mask a secret war until someone bothered to lift it. Nora's bank statement lay open between them. The first charge to Save the Arctic Mothers had been $25, the amount Nora remembered approving after a presentation at Bright Antler. The second was $49, the third was $75. Then smaller withdrawals followed, each routed through different processing names, neat little crumbs crossing state lines. Minnesota, Michigan, Alaska. Elara did not touch her badge. She was still on recovery leave. She was supposed to be helping Alder breathe easier, not pulling at the first loose thread of a federal case. But Alder sat beside her chair, sable shoulders still, eyes fixed on the paper as if the ink itself had a scent. Nora tried to laugh. Maybe I clicked something wrong. I am not exactly a magician with computers. She was wearing a lavender cardigan over a flowered blouse, her silver hair pinned softly above her ears. But the brightness from yesterday had dimmed. The woman at the talk showed pictures of polar bear mothers, little ones beside them. I thought, well, I have a warm bed and more pie than common sense. I can spare a little. Her voice caught on the last words, not from fear, but from shame, and that made Elara's chest tighten. People like Nora were not foolish. They were generous. And generosity, in the wrong hands, became a door thieves did not deserve to open. Elara photographed the receipts, the processor names, and the Northern Renewal Trust logo at the bottom of the donation page. Then she stepped onto the porch and called her regional office. Her supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Daniel Mercer, answered after the third ring. Mercer was a square-jawed man in his late 40s with clipped blonde-gray hair and a voice that always sounded freshly ironed. He believed in procedure, caution, and leaving emotion outside the report. Elara respected him, even when he made her feel like a storm trapped inside a filing cabinet. "I'm on leave," she told him, "but I have possible elder fraud tied to a charity processor, interstate routing, and a wildlife sanctuary receiving related funds." There was a pause. "You are supposed to be resting Alder." "I am. He found the first irregularity." Mercer sighed in the weary way of a man who had heard stranger things and disliked that they were often true. He authorized a limited preliminary inquiry, nothing dramatic, no solo heroics, and if protected wildlife entered the picture, she was to coordinate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Elara agreed. She looked down at Alder. "Limited," she whispered. Alder blinked once, which was his way of saying humans invented very optimistic words. At Bright Antler, Maggie Bell looked older in the office light than she had in the sun. The sanctuary manager stood with her arms folded over a faded green workshirt, her lean face lined by years of weather and worry. She listened as Elara asked about Northern Renewal Trust, then rubbed the bridge of her nose. "They helped us when we were nearly finished," Maggie said. "The lion enclosure needed repairs. Arya needed specialized care. Our old freezer failed. I thought they were angels with accountants." Her voice was honest, and that honesty mattered. If Maggie was hiding something, she was doing it from herself first. A man entered before Elara could answer. Graham Pike carried a leather folder and a smile polished smooth enough to slide off glass. He was in his early 40s, tall and narrow, with neatly parted black hair, pale skin that rarely seemed to meet the sun, and a trimmed beard shaped with almost mathematical care. His blue shirt had no wrinkles. His shoes had no dust. In a place full of straw, fur, feed, and honest animal odor, Graham looked like a bank lobby pretending to love nature. "Agent Vance," he said, extending a hand. "Graham Pike, Operations and Finance. We value transparency here." Alder stepped between them. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He simply placed his body in front of Elara's knee and stared at Graham with the heavy silence of a church bell before it rings. Graham's smile thinned by a single careful inch. From behind the veterinary building came a sudden hiss of cold air, sharp and white, followed by the clean snap of metal sealing against metal. Alder's head turned so fast the room seemed to tilt with him, and for one breath, every polite word on Graham Pike's face disappeared. Graham recovered first. "The cold storage unit. Temperamental thing." Elara asked to see it. He led them through a rear corridor smelling of disinfectant, hay, and machine oil. The storage area was clean, lined with shelves of medicine, bandages, labeled food supplements, and veterinary records. Most of it looked ordinary. One locked compartment did not. A crate inside bore the same wording Elara had photographed the day before. Frozen aquatic research samples. Graham explained that it was a misdirected shipment from Duluth Harbor, fish disease research, nothing more. Yet the internal invoice clipped to the side read, "Veterinary diagnostic material, frozen biological review." "Fish or veterinary material?" Elara asked. Graham smiled softly. Administrative language can be clumsy. Caleb Rourke appeared at the open door before Graham could say more. He wore the same faded flannel, sleeves rolled, to reveal strong forearms marked with old pale lines from work and weather. His dark hair was damp, his beard rough, his hazel eyes unreadable. "Maggie needs you by the North Pen," he told Graham. Then he looked at Elara. "Sometimes shipments get mislabeled. No need to turn a paperwork bruise into a broken leg." It was a strange thing to say, and stranger because Alder did not object to him. With Graham, the dog had become a wall. With Caleb, he only watched, solemn and uncertain. Elara added that to the growing list of things that did not fit. By late afternoon, a Fish and Wildlife contact confirmed that a refrigerated container at Duluth Harbor had been held for a temperature discrepancy and mismatched customs code. The manifest claimed salmon disease samples. The preliminary scan showed hundreds of small tubes, many with altered labels. Nothing was confirmed yet, but the paperwork had been touched by someone who knew how official forms breathed. Elara found Caleb near the meadow at dusk, feeding the lionesses from outside a secure barrier. Solace watched him with old golden eyes. Mercy rested in the grass. Juniper paced once, then settled. Caleb did not look at Elara when he spoke. "There is a name people whisper around frozen shipments, Operation Winter Ark." "What is it?" "Not ivory, not skins, not trophies." His voice dropped. "Something smaller, colder, more profitable." He would say no more, except that she should not walk into it without a team. That night, Alder led Elara back to Arya's enclosure. The Canada lynx was awake on her stone, silver-gray fur dim beneath the security lights, green-gold eyes fixed toward the veterinary building. Caleb stood in the darkness behind the fence, half shadow, half confession. Arya was taken from a biological trap line, he said quietly. They did not take her life. They took what belonged to her future. Elara looked at the thin, pale mark behind Arya's ear, then beyond it to the cold storage room glowing faint blue in the night. She understood then that this case had not begun with a loud threat or a dramatic chase. It had begun with quiet withdrawals from a kind woman's account, a mislabeled crate, and silent tubes waiting in the cold. By the time dawn touched the roof of the Willow Cup Inn, Elara Vance was no longer pretending this was a recovery trip. She still moved carefully, still followed procedure, still kept her notes clean enough for any courtroom to read. But something had changed in the night. The case had grown roots. It had reached from Nora Bell's small bank statement to Bright Antler's cold storage room, from a mislabeled container in Duluth to a wounded lynx who stared toward the dark as if she remembered the shape of every hand that had ever frightened her. Elara called Daniel Mercer before breakfast, gave him the container discrepancy, the charity routing, the possible protected species angle, and Caleb Rourke's warning about Operation Winter Ark. Mercer did not like the sound of any of it. That alone told Elara she had stepped onto real ground. By 9, she had permission to widen the preliminary inquiry, still limited, still cautious, but now with FBI Financial Crimes, U.S., Fish and Wildlife Service, and DOJ Environmental Crimes Section looped in at the beginning. Caleb was waiting behind Bright Antler's maintenance barn when she arrived. He wore a dark thermal shirt under his faded flannel, his sleeves pushed up, his face rough with a night of little sleep. In daylight, he looked less like a strange caretaker and more like a man built from secrets and bad weather. His cheekbones were sharp, his jaw dark with a short beard, and his hazel eyes carried that distant focus Elara had seen in military witnesses who never wasted motion. Alder stood beside Elara, sable coat shining in the pale sun, ears forward, calm but watchful. Caleb looked at the dog before he looked at her. "You asked what I was doing here," he said. "The clean answer is animal care. The true answer is less tidy." He told her enough, but not everything. He had been a Navy SEAL, with portions of his military record sealed. After leaving service, he refused private security contracts and drifted back toward animal rescue. The one thing that had existed in his heart before war taught him how to disappear. A small federal wildlife trafficking task group had used him as an informal source because he understood routes, fences, night movement, frightened animals, and the kind of people who smiled while hiding cargo. He came to Bright Antler first because it reminded him of an old childhood dream called the Quiet Field, a place he had once drawn in a school notebook after his mother brought him to a rescue center near Lake Superior. She had been a soft-spoken volunteer with tired hands and a patient soul, and young Caleb had spent afternoons sitting outside the enclosure of an old rescued lioness, reading stories through the fence. He learned there that trust was not conquered. It was returned, one quiet hour at a time. "Then I noticed the shipments," Caleb said. "Cold storage, odd hours, paperwork too clean." Arya arrived half-frozen with a false transfer history, and Graham kept asking when she would be moved again. His voice hardened, but only slightly. "I stayed to watch the gate, and because Solace sleeps when I am in the meadow. Truth is, so do I." He looked away toward the lion enclosure, where 3 golden shapes rested under the morning shade. "Rooms with humming machines do not do me many favors." He drove Elara and Alder north along a narrow road lined with black spruce and birch, away from town and toward the quieter edge of Lake Superior. The lake appeared between the trees in flashes of steel blue light. Their destination was a small cabin set back from the road, roof patched with green metal, woodpiles stacked with military neatness, windows crowded with field notes and pressed leaves. Dr. Elias Whitcomb opened the door before Caleb knocked. He was 68, tall but stooped, with a narrow face, white hair falling loose over his forehead, and a short gray beard that gave him the look of an old prophet who preferred data tables to miracles. His wool sweater had elbow patches, his hands were thin and ink-stained, and his eyes, pale blue behind wire-rimmed glasses, were tired but fiercely awake. "You are the FBI agent with the dog," Whitcomb said. "And you are the scientist they tried to turn into a footnote," Elara replied. A faint smile passed over his face. "Footnotes are at least still printed." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, old paper, and tea gone cold. Maps covered one wall, migration routes, denning areas, coastal plain survey grids, and red circles around places whose names carried more history than most court filings could hold. Whitcomb had spent decades studying winter-adapted species, porcupine caribou, polar bear mothers, Canada lynx, and the subtle ways animals changed course before human machines admitted they had made an impact. He had been part of an environmental review tied to ANWR's coastal plain until he objected to altered models. After that, his name began to vanish. Emails stopped including him. Drafts returned without his notes. Consultants called his work outdated, not openly foolish, not directly unwell, just retired, emotional, behind the times. It was a quiet kind of erasure, polished enough to look professional. Whitcomb opened a locked metal case and removed a copied data drive wrapped in cloth. Beside it lay the cracked housing of a satellite collar once fitted to a polar bear mother. "This is not the original collar," he said. "That is in a secure evidence chain now. This is my duplicate housing and the data copy I made before someone decided the mother's path was inconvenient." A tiny sound came from his old laptop, one thin, trembling pulse like a heartbeat under ice. And on the screen, a blue dot moved across a white map, then two smaller dots followed behind it before all three suddenly turned away from a line of seismic trucks. No one spoke for several seconds. Elara had read thousands of reports in her life. None of them had ever breathed like that. Whitcomb showed her the official summary next. The language was dry, clean, and almost gentle in its dishonesty. No significant behavioral deviation observed. Yet the raw data showed the mother changed course after low-frequency ground vibration began. Not panic, not drama. Just a living creature choosing distance, leading her young away from something human paperwork later pretended did not matter. "The coastal plain is not empty," Whitcomb said softly. "It is a nursery, a crossing place, a promise kept by animals older than our maps. If the review makes the disturbance look small, the June 5th lease sale goes forward on a softened truth." He then turned to Operation Winter Ark. The stolen samples, he believed, were not random. The network sought individuals with rare survival traits, polar bear mothers enduring long fasting periods, caribou with extraordinary migration stamina, lynx with snow-adapted movement, even gray wolves from far northern packs. "They call it preservation," he said. "But preservation without consent, without law, without ecosystem, becomes possession. They are not saving a song. They are locking the notes in a freezer and selling keys." Alder had been quiet until then. Suddenly he rose and moved toward the corner near the stove. He sniffed the floorboards, paused, and pressed one paw against a loose plank. Whitcomb went pale. "I forgot that was there." Caleb lifted the plank with a pocket tool. Beneath it sat a small tin box. Inside were photographs of Arya when she had first been recovered. Thinner then, eyes wide, the pale mark behind her ear fresh but not described in cruel detail. There was also a partial transport map, a Duluth Harbor container code, and a handwritten note on the back of Arya's photo. Elara read it once, then again. She did not lose her life, but someone tried to take her future. By afternoon, Whitcomb had given Elara a copy of the collar data and part of the transport map, all logged, photographed, and sealed according to procedure. She knew now that Arya mattered, but Arya alone could not carry a case. They needed money trails, shipment records, lab confirmation, witness statements, and a bridge between Northern Renewal Trust, the mislabeled container, and the altered ANWR review. Still, as Elara stepped outside into the cold blue light, she felt the case becoming less like fog and more like a road. Then an SUV rolled slowly past the cabin. It was dark green, clean, and too far from the main road to be lost. Caleb's face changed. "That plate was near Bright Antler 2 nights ago," he said. "It is not real." Alder moved before Elara gave a command. He placed himself between Whitcomb and the road, ears high, body still as carved stone. The SUV continued around the bend and vanished among the pines. Elara looked at Whitcomb, then at the sealed evidence bag in her hand. In the cold afternoon light, she understood the old scientist had not been forgotten because he was wrong. He had been erased because he had kept the part of the truth others needed buried. By the next morning, the case had become a map of moving money. Elara Vance sat in a temporary workspace borrowed from the Duluth field office, surrounded by bank records, charity receipts, shipping invoices, and photographs of cold storage labels. The room smelled of paper, stale coffee, and winter coats drying on hooks. Alder lay beneath the table, his sable body still, his amber-brown eyes half open, resting but not truly asleep. He seemed to know the difference between ordinary quiet and the kind that came before a door opened. On the wall, Elara had pinned 3 names in a triangle: Save the Arctic Mothers, Northern Renewal Trust, and Bright Antler Wildlife Sanctuary. The first had touched Norabelle's kindness. The second had swallowed the money. The third had offered a warm face to something colder underneath. The pattern was simple enough to be ugly. Small donations from elderly supporters moved into Save the Arctic Mothers, then into Northern Renewal Trust, then outward again, sanctuary repairs, refrigerated transport, consulting fees, and a private research site in Michigan called Black Fur Research Annex. Graham Pike's name appeared on the local contracts. Not as a mastermind, not as a king, more like a gatekeeper with clean shoes and a soft voice, signing the forms that let cold crates pass through a place built for mercy. Maggie Bell had believed the money saved her sanctuary. In a way, it had. That was the cruel trick. A false blessing can still repair a fence. Caleb Rourke stood near the map, arms folded, his dark beard rougher than usual, his hazel eyes fixed on the route from Minnesota to Michigan. He had slept only a few hours in the meadow, and the lines near his mouth showed it. "Graham handled the storage schedule," he said. "He always said donors liked efficiency. I should have pushed harder." Elara looked up. "You were one man watching a locked room with no warrant." "I was also the one sleeping closest to the back gate." "You were keeping Solace calm." Caleb's jaw moved once, but he said nothing. Elara understood the silence. Good people often mistook survival for failure because they had not managed to stop every shadow from passing through the door. The federal team moved carefully. Black Fur could not be stormed on suspicion and instinct. They needed paperwork, probable cause, interagency coordination. By late afternoon, a limited inspection was authorized through a combination of customs irregularities, protected species concerns, and financial fraud indicators. Elara drove east with Caleb and Alder, following 2 vehicles from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Their lead contact was Marin Holt, a FWS special agent in her early 40s, broad-shouldered and freckled, with copper-red hair braided tight beneath a dark cap. Marin had pale green eyes, a calm face, and the blunt kindness of someone who had spent years seeing animals treated as inventory and still refused to let bitterness take the wheel. Black Fur Research Annex stood in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, inside a repurposed industrial site built over an old copper mine. Pine trees crowded the perimeter. Snow lingered in gray patches under the shade, even though spring had already brightened the roads. The main building looked respectable. Brushed steel sign, clean glass doors, security gate, tasteful landscaping, and a slogan etched near the entrance: Preserving Tomorrow's Biodiversity. Today, Elara read it twice and felt the old anger rise in her chest. Some lies wore better clothes than truth. Dr. Silas Vane greeted them in the lobby before they could ask for him. He was 52, tall and elegant, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead, smooth olive-toned skin, and a neatly trimmed gray beard that gave him a statesman's calm. His suit was charcoal, his voice warm, his smile modest enough to be practiced. He looked less like a criminal and more like a man donors trusted with large checks and fragile words. "Agent Vance," he said, offering his hand. "Special Agent Holt. We are always happy to assist legitimate conservation oversight." "Then you will not mind a review of your cold storage logs," Marin said. "Of course not." Vane's eyes moved briefly to Alder. "Beautiful dog." Alder stared back without wagging his tail. Vane led them through the legal side first, labeled freezers, chain of custody forms, samples from fish, birds, and veterinary studies. Everything was clean. Too clean. Caleb drifted behind them, not touching, only watching. Near the end of the hall, he paused by a security dome and tilted his head. Elara noticed the motion. A camera covered the corridor, but not the service alcove beyond it. A blind spot, the kind a careless building might have by mistake, and a careful one by design. Somewhere beneath the polished floor, a deep mechanical thrum rose and vanished, followed by a faint blue flash under a sealed door. Alder stopped so suddenly his nails clicked once on the tile, and even Vane's perfect smile paused half a second too long. "Backup refrigeration," Vane said smoothly. "Old mine tunnels make excellent temperature buffers." "Let's see them," Elara replied. The service door opened into a concrete stairwell, descending into cooler air. The lower level smelled of stone, coolant, and sealed plastic. Here the respectable story began to thin. Behind a secondary barrier, Marin found storage units not listed in the official tour. Some held legal research material, others did not match the manifest. Labels had codes instead of species names. Several codes matched the Duluth container sequence. One small rack carried identifiers linked to ARIA's transfer file. Another referenced the copied data from the polar bear collar. Elara did not speak at first. She photographed, logged, and let the evidence breathe. In another cabinet, a digital ledger showed access rights, private preservation contracts, and cell line priority reservations. It was not the fantasy of completed miracles. It was worse in its ordinary greed. Vane was selling access to rare genetic material, living cell lines, and shadow research agreements to wealthy clients who wanted to own what nature had spent ages shaping. The cloning language appeared only as a future promise, carefully dressed as long-term restoration potential. Vane watched her read. "You disapprove. I understand the difference between conservation and possession." His expression softened as if speaking to a child. "Agent Vance, governments move slowly, habitats vanish, climate shifts, species fade. Private preservation is not theft. It is insurance." Caleb's voice came from the blind spot near a side passage. "Insurance does not hide in unlisted freezers." Alder moved toward that passage, nose low, body tense but controlled. He followed the scent of dry ice and preservative to a narrow storage room behind a rolling metal shelf. Inside were transport maps layered over environmental survey grids. Coastal plain, Canning River boundary, access corridors, timelines that matched seismic survey windows. Elara saw the shape of it then. As reports made the disturbance look smaller, Operation Winter Ark harvested biological material from the very areas most likely to be changed. One hand softened the paper. The other emptied the cradle. Before Marin could secure the room fully, a silent alert flashed on a wall panel. Vane's face did not change, but a distant door shut somewhere above. By the time agents locked down the site, Vane's office was empty. His personal terminal had been wiped locally, though not fast enough to erase everything. They recovered partial data, client categories, transport codes, fragments of Northern Renewal Trust communications, and references to Graham Pike. Then Caleb's phone buzzed. He read the message once and held it out to Elara. No name, no number she recognized. Just one line, "You saved a few vials. The winter ark has already sailed." At the same moment, a call came from Maggie Bell. Graham had returned to Bright Antler with emergency paperwork to move Aria for specialized treatment before dawn. Elara looked at the recovered data, then at the date circled in red on her field notebook. June 5, 2026. The ANWR lease sale was coming like weather over flat land. They were no longer trying only to protect a lynx with a pale mark behind her ear. They had to place the truth into the legal record before a living landscape was sold under the shelter of softened numbers. Graham Pike returned to Bright Antler just before sunrise, when the sanctuary was still wrapped in blue-gray mist and the world seemed too sleepy to defend itself. His black SUV rolled through the back gate with its headlights low, followed by a white veterinary transport van with no sanctuary logo on the side. Graham stepped out wearing a navy coat, polished shoes, and the kind of calm face that made lies look like business appointments. In one hand, he carried a folder thick with stamped pages. In the other, a phone he kept checking every few seconds, as if waiting for permission from a darker room. Maggie Bell met him outside the veterinary building in a fleece jacket thrown over her pajamas, her short gray hair flattened on one side from sleep. She looked smaller in the dawn light, no longer the quick-laughing manager from Northern Kindness Day, but a tired woman who had spent years holding a struggling sanctuary together with duct tape, donated feed, and faith. Graham told her Aria needed immediate transfer to a specialist facility in Wisconsin. He showed her a veterinary order, a transport authorization, and a donor-funded medical request. The papers looked real enough to frighten an honest person. "She was stable last night," Maggie said, hugging her arms tight. "Dr. Larkin said no move until federal review cleared." "Dr. Larkin was overruled by the funding board," Graham replied gently. "Maggie, this is not punishment. It is care." From the lynx enclosure came a low, restless sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just a thin thread of fear moving through the cold air. Aria stood on her flat stone, silver-gray fur lifted along her spine, tufted ears sharp against the morning. Her green-gold eyes fixed on the van, and the pale mark behind her ear seemed almost white in the dim light. Then Caleb Rourke stepped out from beside the feed shed. He looked like he had been carved out of the dawn itself, faded flannel under a brown work jacket, dark hair loose from sleep, short beard shadowing his jaw, shoulders square but hands open at his sides. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward Graham. He simply placed himself between the van and Aria's enclosure. "No animal leaves this property without an independent vet and federal witness present." Graham's smile tightened. "You are a caretaker, Caleb, not law enforcement." "No," Caleb said, "but I know the sound of a creature being rushed out before daylight." Behind the meadow fence, Solace rose first. The older lioness lifted her pale gold head, ears forward. Mercy followed, moving slowly along the fence line, heavy paws silent in the grass. Juniper stood last, the most watchful of the three, her amber eyes fixed on Graham's van. The lionesses did not charge, did not roar, did not become a spectacle. Their stillness was worse for Graham. It made the whole sanctuary feel as if nature itself had paused to remember his face. Elara arrived minutes later with Marenholt and 2 FWS officers. Alder jumped from the vehicle before Elara had fully opened the door. The 5-year-old German Shepherd landed lightly, sable coat, dark against the mist, ears high, nose already working. Elara wore her field jacket and calmest expression, though her heartbeat had sharpened the moment Maggie called. Marin, broad-shouldered and red-haired beneath her cap, held the emergency inspection order in one hand. Her voice was low, direct, and without ornament. "Mr. Pike, step away from the transport van." Graham gave a small laugh. "This is an approved medical transfer." "Then you will not mind us reviewing the vehicle." A sudden metallic click sounded beneath the van floor, followed by a soft release of cold vapor that curled around Alder's paws like breath from a hidden winter. Arya stopped pacing, and for one frozen second, every living thing in the yard seemed to listen. Alder moved first. He did not lunge at Graham. He did not bark. He lowered his nose and followed the vapor to a narrow seam beneath the van's rear compartment. Mara knelt, found a concealed latch, and opened a panel hidden under the transport floor. Inside was a biological shipping case packed with cooling material, blank specimen labels, false aquatic research tags, and a small sealed toolkit. Beside it lay a chip drive taped beneath a strip of insulation. Graham's face finally changed. Only a little. But Elara saw it. The tiny collapse of a man whose perfect paperwork had met a dog's nose. The chip did not solve the whole case, but it gave them what they needed. Route codes, transfer windows, bright antler to black fur to a private courier hub, cross-references to Northern Renewal Trust invoices, and one file labeled with Arya's old transfer number. Arya was not magic evidence. She was not the case by herself. She was a living witness to a pattern. The medical records, the old chip history, the mark behind her ear, the black fur sample code, and the hidden van compartment all pointed in the same direction. Graham Pike was arrested before the sun cleared the tree line. The charges would begin with financial fraud, false transport declarations, obstruction, and suspected involvement in unlawful movement of protected biological material. More would come later after lab confirmation and full digital review. He did not shout. Men like Graham rarely did. He adjusted his cuffs as if he were correcting a sleeve at a charity dinner. At first, he said nothing. Then Marin placed the black fur partial ledger in front of him, and Elara showed him the donation trail from Nora Bell and dozens of older supporters who thought they were helping polar bear mothers. Something in his face flickered, not guilt, but calculation. He began to talk. Northern Renewal Trust had funded Bright Antler because the sanctuary looked pure. Videos of Caleb calming the lionesses brought donations. Photos of Arya recovering made people open their hearts. Save the Arctic Mothers created small, steady money streams and, more importantly, public warmth. Community support, Graham called it. Elara heard the uglier truth beneath the softer phrase, borrowed innocence. By mid-morning, Dr. Elias Whitcomb arrived with Caleb, carrying a flat archival tube against his chest like a man protecting a sleeping child. His white hair blew across his forehead, and his wire-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose. Inside the tube was the gene map he had rebuilt from scattered data: polar bear collar records, porcupine caribou movement grids, lynx sample codes, and northern wolf references. The collection sites overlapped with areas expected to face pressure from survey routes, access corridors, and lease activity near ANWR's coastal plain and the Canning River boundary. The meaning was stark. Operation Winter Ark was gathering biological material from places likely to change, while altered environmental language made those changes look smaller on paper. Maggie stood beside the lynx enclosure, silent and pale. "I let them in," she whispered. "I thought they were saving us." Elara looked at the woman's worn hands, the sanctuary mud on her boots, the grief in her face. "They used your kindness. That is not the same as your guilt." Caleb stayed near Arya after the officers took Graham away. "I came here thinking I would protect them," he said quietly. Solace lay in the grass behind him, Mercy beside her, Juniper still standing watch. "Turns out they kept some part of me alive too." Elara glanced down at Alder, who was watching Caleb with that same old soul stillness. At last, she understood why her dog had trusted him before she did. Some wounded creatures recognized the ones who had learned to sit through the night without asking for thanks. By noon, Aria was secured under FWS supervision and an independent veterinarian's care. No transfer, no hidden van, no cold case waiting beneath the floor. Alder lay outside her enclosure, chin on his paws. For the first time, Aria stepped down from her stone and settled closer to the fence, not tame, not surrendered, only less alone. As morning brightened over Bright Antler's golden field, Elara looked from the sealed evidence bags to the animals watching from their quiet places. The proof was finally strong enough for the next battle. Not in the meadow, not beside the cages, but in court, where cold numbers would have to answer for the living hearts they tried to erase. By the time the case reached Washington and Alaska, Operation Winter Ark no longer looked like a strange thread pulled from a small sanctuary in Minnesota. It looked like a net. Elara Vance saw it spread across conference tables, court filings, shipping records, frozen sample logs, donation receipts, and satellite maps of a white northern plain most Americans would never stand upon, yet somehow still depended on. The evidence had grown beyond Graham Pike, beyond black fur, beyond one frightened Canada lynx with a pale mark behind her ear. It now touched ANWR's coastal plain, the coming June 5th lease sale, and the old question every generation must answer in its own time. What are we willing to trade for a little more comfort today? Elara worked beside FBI Financial Crimes, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Customs and Border Protection, DOJ Environmental Crimes Section, independent scientists, and conservation attorneys who looked as tired as candle wicks after a long vigil. Marin Holt helped secure the wildlife evidence. Daniel Mercer, Elara's careful supervisor, surprised her by backing the wider filing once the money trail, black fur data, Graham's statement, and Dr. Elias Whitcomb's records aligned. Graham had explained the local machinery. Northern Renewal Trust made dirty intentions look charitable, Bright Antler gave the scheme a kind face, and Save the Arctic Mothers turned the kindness of ordinary people into public cover. He had not become noble by talking, but the truth did not require him to be noble. It only required him to be useful. Dr. Whitcomb stood before the legal review panel with his back straighter than Elara had ever seen it. At 68, he still looked like an old scholar shaped by winter cabins and field notebooks. White hair untamed, gray beard neat but soft, wire-rimmed glasses low on his nose, thin hands steady over a stack of exhibits. Months earlier, consultants had called him emotional, outdated, too retired to understand the models. Now those same models were projected on a federal screen beside the raw collar data from the polar bear mother. The original path showed her changing course after low-frequency survey vibrations began. The official summary had softened that movement into near invisibility. When Dr. Whitcomb finished, there was no applause. Courtrooms rarely clap for dignity restored. But Elara saw his eyes shine as his name was formally restored to the scientific record. That was enough. For some people, justice arrived not as thunder, but as a name printed correctly again. The Gwich'in witness came next. Dr. Nia Crowfeather was a woman in her early 60s, with long dark hair threaded with silver, copper-brown skin weathered by northern wind, and a calm voice that carried neither theater nor pleading. She wore a simple dark jacket and a beaded necklace in soft earth colors. She spoke as an ecologist, a community advocate, and a woman whose people had watched the porcupine caribou long before lease maps learned how to divide the land. She did not turn the coastal plain into myth for strangers. She made it clearer than myth. It was nursery ground, migration memory, food security, cultural survival. When a place is called where life begins, she said, that is not poetry for us. It is responsibility. Then the courtroom speakers released the caller recording. A low tremor under wind, the faint shifting of snow, and 3 small tracking tones moving away from the survey line. For one suspended breath, The room heard not an argument, but a mother leading her young through a world that paperwork had tried to quiet. The emergency request did not save ANWR forever. Elara knew better than to expect one hearing to heal a nation's hunger for resources. But the ruling came before the June 5th sale could proceed as planned. The lease sale was delayed pending review. The environmental record had to be re-examined. Federal investigators were authorized to expand the probe into altered data, illegal biological storage, financial fraud, and cross-border transfer attempts connected to Dr. Silas Vane. Vane was apprehended 2 days later at a small private airfield near the Canadian border. He wore a gray travel coat, leather gloves, and the same smooth composure Elara remembered from Black Fur. In his luggage, agents found encrypted copies of gene access ledgers, client lists, and transfer documents. He still insisted he was preserving life. Elara looked at him across the tarmac, the wind lifting her hair from her collar, and said quietly, "Life does not need a private cage to be protected." For the first time, his face lost a little of its polish. The seized biological materials from Black Fur were not destroyed, hidden, or turned into trophies for another institution. They were transferred under strict oversight to legitimate national conservation repositories, where scientists could preserve what had been taken and use it lawfully for species protection, not private ownership. Elara made sure that distinction stayed in the public statement. Science was not the villain. Greed wearing science's coat was. Back in Loonhaven, Nora Bell and dozens of older donors received notice that the fraudulent withdrawals would be returned. Nora cried in the Willow Cup Inn kitchen while pretending to search for cinnamon. She wore a blue cardigan that day, flower on one sleeve, silver hair pinned badly, because she had been baking since dawn. "I feel silly," she admitted. Elara shook her head. "You were kind. They counted on making kindness feel foolish." Nora wiped her eyes with a towel. "Well, let the record show an old woman noticed a few missing dollars." Elara smiled. "The record will show exactly that." Bright Antler changed too. Northern Renewal Trust was cut away like a bad branch. Maggie Bell stayed, though the shame nearly broke her heart at first. She rebuilt with clean donors, public oversight, and a new education program about wildlife rescue and Arctic conservation. Caleb Rourke no longer had to exist only in the margins. He remained the man who slept in fields and spoke softly to wounded animals, but now he also worked openly with FWS as a field consultant. He still avoided speeches. The lionesses appreciated that. Aria was transferred weeks later to a northern semi-wild rehabilitation reserve, a place of spruce ridges, stone ledges, and deep quiet. She was not made into a mascot. She was not asked to love people. She was simply given room to become herself again. Before she left, the Canada lynx stood by her enclosure fence, silver-gray fur bright in the morning light, green-gold eyes fixed on Alder. The German shepherd sat on the other side, sable coat still, ears forward, old soul gaze gentle and grave. They did not touch. They did not need to. Some farewells are holier when nothing is claimed. That evening, Alder slept on the porch of the Willow Cup Inn while the kitchen refrigerator hummed behind the screen door. For the first time in weeks, he did not wake. Elara sat nearby, one hand resting on his warm back, and understood that she had brought him north to heal. Instead, he had led her to a place where healing was needed by many. At sunset, she found Caleb in the meadow again, lying in the grass near Solace, Mercy, and Juniper. This time she did not reach for her radio. Caleb opened one eye. "You are not calling staff?" "Only if Juniper complains about your snoring." For the first time since she met him, Caleb laughed without looking surprised by the sound. The sun lowered behind the pines, gilding the lions, the field, the fences, and the woman with the dog who had followed a cold hum into the heart of a hidden wrong. Elara watched Alder gaze toward the darkening forest and knew this much was true. Life did not belong to frozen vials, private contracts, or polished seals on quiet documents. Life belonged to the sky, the herd, the land, and the brave hearts willing to guard what was fragile before it was too late. In the end, Elara, Alder, Caleb, Arya, and the wounded creatures of Bright Antler remind us of one simple truth. Life is not something to be owned, hidden, or used for profit. Life is a gift. Every animal, every forest, every quiet field, and every human heart carries a purpose that cannot be measured by money, contracts, or power. This story teaches us that kindness is never weakness. Nora's generosity was used by dishonest people, but that did not make her foolish. It made her human. Doctor. Whitcomb was ignored because he was older, but the truth he protected became the key that helped save others. Caleb thought he was only caring for wounded animals, but those animals helped heal the broken places inside him. And Alder, a loyal dog carrying his own silent pain, led everyone toward the truth when human eyes were too busy to see it. Sometimes in life, we do not understand why we are sent to a certain place, meet a certain person, or feel pulled toward a small warning in our hearts. Maybe it is not coincidence. Maybe it is grace. Maybe it is God placing a quiet sign in front of us, asking us to listen before it is too late. A dog's instinct, an old woman's missing dollars, a scientist's forgotten notes, and a wounded lynx's silent eyes all became part of something greater than any one person could have planned. So in our daily lives, let us pay attention to the small things. Check on the elderly neighbor who seems lonely. Protect animals when they are weak. Speak up when something feels wrong. Do not laugh at someone's compassion. Do not ignore the quiet person who still carries the truth. And never believe that age, pain, or past mistakes make a life worthless. God often uses the overlooked, the wounded, and the humble to reveal what the powerful try to hide. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson stayed with you most. Have you ever seen an animal sense something before people did? Have you ever felt that God guided you through a small moment that later changed everything? Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the sacred bond between humans and animals. May God bless you, protect your family, soften your heart toward every living creature, and guide your steps toward kindness every day.